Yep, just to let y'all know, I am recording this today. And like to give you guys a brief update from last night's annual business meeting, which was also virtual. A lot of you were on that as well, and we appreciate that. Last night, Clint McCoy, Division Wildlife Deer Biologist, provided us with a really good update on the status of CWD in Ohio. So thank you, Clint. That was a great presentation, and a recording of that meeting, including Clint's update, will eventually be uploaded to the OWMA YouTube channel, and there'll be a link for it on our webpage in case you want to view that. Also, last night at the annual business meeting, we announced Mark Wiley, the grouse and turkey biologist with Ohio Division of Wildlife. He was voted in as the new president-elect. The votes between Mark and Christina Schlover, the other candidate, was pretty close. And Christina, we thank you for running. And we also thank you for already expressing interest in volunteering in the future and even running again next year. So we really appreciate that. Candidates are difficult to find sometimes, so we really do appreciate that. And last night, I technically relinquished the gavel to Cody Grasser, who is now the president for 2021. And with that, I will turn it over to Cody, and he is going to present the Annual Achievement Award.
Thanks, Caleb. Okay. As Caleb said, I have the pleasure of announcing our Annual Achievement Award. And so what I'm going to do is read a description of the award first, and then read a bio about this year's recipient. So one of the Ohio Wildlife Management Association's objectives is to present an annual achievement award in recognition of an outstanding contribution to wildlife research and management in Ohio. And this award is presented to an active OWMA member who has made an outstanding contribution to wildlife management in any of the following areas, including writing technical or popular papers on wildlife management in journals or magazines, writing or developing newspaper articles or columns, drawings, motion pictures, paintings, photographs, books, bulletins, pamphlets, or radio and TV scripts, development of new equipment or techniques, development of new and successful game or fish management techniques in the wild or at fish and game hatcheries, active and proven conservation education programs for youth and or the general public, exceptional performance of duties in wildlife administration or education, and then the award may also be presented for a specific accomplishment or for consistent or noteworthy career performance. And I think you'll find this year's recipient kind of checks all those boxes. So this year's award recipient graduated from the Ohio State University, where they majored in wildlife management in 1977. And prior to their career with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, or at that time, Soil Conservation Service, they worked with a variety of agencies and conservation groups, including the Peace Corps, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in Michigan, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Illinois, the Horicon National Wildlife Refuge in Wisconsin, and the Great Lakes Fishery Laboratory in Michigan. During this recipient's time with the Peace Corps, they served as a freshwater fisheries extension agent in the Kalasin province of Thailand, where from 1980 to 1982, they provided information and instructions to farmers regarding pond management and fish rearing techniques. The recipient started as a soil conservationist with the Soil Conservation Service in Northeast Indiana in 1983. They then moved to Massachusetts in 1987, where they served as a district conservationist in 3 different locations. And then in 1990, they were able to come back to their home state here in Ohio as a state biologist for Soil Conservation Service. And that was their dream job. The recipient remained in that position until the end of 2015, when they retired. Throughout their career, the recipient has guided landowners in applying and implementing conservation practices across the Midwest and along the East Coast. and they have promoted conservation through providing technical advice, outreach, informational materials, and delivering presentations to conservation agencies and the public. Their expert technical knowledge, support, and leadership has assisted landowners, land managers, NRCS staff, and partner agencies to promote large and small-scale conservation measures for nearly 40 years. During their career, the recipient enjoyed volunteering with wetland restoration projects in the community, invasive plant removal projects, Earth Day tree plantings, and community cleanups, as well as working the state fair booth for the agency. Additionally, they were a guest lecturer for a wetland ecology class at OSU for many years. They've spoke at numerous conferences and community meetings where they promoted conservation, wetland identification, habitat management, conservation planning, and environmental impact assessments. The recipient has also served on committees from the county level to the national level, providing insight toward achieving more conservation on the landscape. After retiring in 2015 as a state biologist for Ohio NRCS, this recipient returned in 2016 as a part-time ACES employee, where they continue to serve as a highly valued member of the NRCS team. Around the office, they are known as Yoda to their fellow resource staff team, and their knowledge and background information of the agency and conservation programs is willingly shared with fellow coworkers and partners. The recipient loves to garden, camp, hike, and travel to see family and friends, and is looking forward to getting back into those more once COVID settles down. Their favorite activity is spending time with their young grandson, teaching him how to explore out in nature's wild playground, watching birds, and looking for critters under logs and rocks, and helping to inspire the next generation of conservationists. We have a well-accomplished recipient, and it is my pleasure to announce that earlier this month, the Ohio Wildlife Management Association was able to present the 2021 Annual Achievement Award to Mark DeBrock. So please join me in giving Mark a virtual round of applause and sending him congratulations. Happy to say that Mark is with us this morning. Obviously, you see from the picture he's received the award, but we're going to give him a minute to say a few words. So I'm gonna stop sharing the photo here, Mark, so we can see you. You've got the floor.
Okay, I think you can see me. I just was on a Teams meeting platform, and all the buttons are in the different places here on Zoom. First, I know you saw me, or I had the plaque, but when I found out I got this, I was really surprised, and even more surprised, I'm really appreciative of the Ohio Wildlife Management Association giving me this award. You know, for the most of my career, I worked for NRCS, not a wildlife focused agency, but I was able to do a lot of wildlife habitat development work, and it's a relatively small part of what we do all overall, but I got to do a lot of things and a lot of opportunities to work with a lot of people. And so as I've tried to promote, assist in development of habitat, been a lot of people that have, you know, really made it possible and made it enjoyable, rewarding as well. Two groups in particular. First, the landowners, obviously, people that are willing to do something with their land for wildlife. It's been a real pleasure working with them, helping them do things, you know, the effort they put into it. And so working with them has always given me a certain amount of certainly joy and satisfaction in what I'm doing. The other group of people, and many of you are on here today, is all the different partner agencies and organizations that have helped me and more importantly, my agency, and made it possible to do some really great things. Take me too long to mention them all, but there's a lot of folks out there, federal, state, local agency, all the groups and organizations that work with various species of wildlife and their habitat. It's really been cool for me to work with all those people. They taught me so much, and quite honestly, they made my job a lot easier. But just one last thought. Back in 1990, when I came back to Ohio to be state biologist for SCS, one of the first people outside the agency I met with was Dave Risley. He was with the private land section of Division of Wildlife at that time. And we met, talked about a lot of job related things. But then afterwards, I asked him, you know, who's it I can get in contact with or meet to get a good feel for wildlife in Ohio? And he said, Mark, you got to get involved with the Ohio Fish and Wildlife Management Association. And yes, back then we were the fish and wildlife. We still let the fish people hang out with us and stuff. But that was really great advice, because OWMA has been really, really helpful part of developing my career. You know, the people you meet through OWMA are great. You get to know a lot of folks that are working in the field. Meetings are always nice. I've always learned a lot that's, interesting and useful to me. Great to find out, what everybody else in the field is doing in Ohio. So OWMA has been really good. And so I'm really thankful to the Ohio Wildlife Management Association for this award and all they've done for me over my career. And it's been a lot to me. So keep up the good work. And Cody, back to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark. And congratulations again. Thank you for your dedicating your life and career to conservation. And I think the state of Ohio and a lot of folks on this call have benefited greatly from it and are indebted to you. So thank you. I'm going to give it back to Caleb Shields.
Thank you, Cody, and congratulations, Mark. That was well deserved. We'll keep moving here. Share my screen again. Here's today's agenda. We're gonna dive into our Q&A session now. To ask questions about their presentations, you would have had to have previously watched them. The first one on the list here is a topic about rabbit hemorrhagic disease. But before I introduce these presenters, I want to say thank you and also apologize to them. There was a big lapse in communication between us, and between when we asked them to present and when they needed to submit their video. But nevertheless, they acted as true professionals, stepped up to the plate, and provided us with a great video with some really good content. So thank you, Dr. Juliana Linick, Dr. Thomas Gidlewski, and thank you, Dr. Lynn Creekmore. These three USDA APHIS employees will be answering your questions about their presentation on rabbit hemorrhagic disease. While everyone is hopefully typing in questions for them in the chat box, before I turn it over to them, I would like to mention that the Ohio Wildlife Management Association and the Ohio chapter of the Wildlife Society is giving away 10 t-shirts today at random. So if you stick around to the end, you may be selected as a lucky winner. And in which case, you can email us a shipping address and we will ship those t-shirts out to you. So with that, I will give our APHIS employees the floor. Thank you.
Good morning, Caleb. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Yeah, great. Hi, this is Julie Lennock, and no problem. We did have a little bit of a snafu, but it may have just as well been on our end because we're all busy as well. I don't know if anyone has had time to watch the video, but it will be recorded to go back to. And I think for all three of us, Tom and Lynn may chime in as well, but the goal of what we're doing is just to share awareness as far as how geographically spread and basically how scary this virus is right now. We're seeing, a very recent jump to Florida in domestic rabbits that we're still working on, but pretty widespread disease within the American Southwest into 8 states now. So we just want people to keep an eye on things, certainly working continuously with our wildlife partners for laboratory submissions. And if you do have a lagomorph death, we do want those investigated so we can determine if it's RHDV2 or not, certainly other causes as well. But we're going to continue to work with the state departments of agriculture, state departments of wildlife to try to understand the geographic spread and how this virus overwinters. So happy to answer any questions, but just wanted to tell you guys we're here and please, please ask questions if you've seen it. And if not, go back and watch it later. And our email addresses are all available to, to follow up at a later date if that's more appropriate.
Okay, we're already having questions come in. Hey, thanks guys again. Welcome to the Q&A. This is awesome. First question comes from Nick Shell. And if you can follow, I'm not sure if you can see, But in the chat, people are putting questions in, but I'm going to read them to you so you don't have to follow along. Nick wants to know, is there evidence of human consumption of infected rabbits affecting people's health?
I can take first stab at that one. No, we would probably guess that at some point someone may have consumed this, but we have no evidence at any time of any human illness, either touching the rabbit or infected tissue or consuming it.
The next question also comes from Nick Shell. He's very, very interested. And we love Nick. That's great. The possible means of spread was well covered in the presentation. Has there been any study or evidence that, or I'm sorry, I'm not, whatever, look at you, if you can look in the chat, that the disease, I'm just going to say, is having measurable negative impacts, declines on wildlife populations and infected?
We've been working with our wildlife agencies in the infected states. Actually, the goal of the role of wildlife services is to be the go-between between the wildlife agencies and APHIS to try to make sure that we capture all of the rabbit hemorrhagic disease that we're having on the landscape. And we work with these folks all the time, and had a meeting not too long ago to try to visit to see what they felt they were seeing. Is it devastating? Is it completely annihilating all our rabbits? And most of the DNR folks that have experience with it believe that it hasn't been a total lethal event, that they're just seeing rabbits come back and there are still rabbits on the landscape. So it doesn't look like a scorched earth situation. One of the other things is we looked at this disease experimentally at Plum Island, and we had about a 60% attack rate in our cottontails. So I'm hoping that can be helping us too, because the domestic rabbits, they're all a European rabbit lineage, and the mortality rate in those animals is much higher, often around 100%. So I'm hoping that the 60% that we've seen experimentally has some bearing on what we're seeing in the wild, such that we don't see complete loss of rabbit species in certain areas. And I guess the other thing we can always fall back on is a lot of people have tried to kill rabbits with various diseases in the past, and they've been unsuccessful. I'm talking about places like Australia and the like. So hopefully our rabbits are pretty tough and they can bounce back from it. Thank you.
Thanks. The next question, and this comes, it's a kind of a statement / question from Jeff Westerfield, who's with Division of Wildlife. He said, obviously you can't find something you're not looking for. He assumes that the recent outbreak in the Southwest is at least in part tied to that. Are there areas you think, potentially Ohio, that you need to do more testing?
Julie, this is Lynn. Can everyone hear me to begin
You're good,
with?
Lynn. Yep, good audio, Lynn. Go
Awesome.
ahead.
Well, I don't know if you guys noticed in the presentation, but in the early part of the presentation, Julie mentioned that in your state, you actually had a brush with this disease back in the past. And as Julie mentioned earlier, we certainly want people out there really investigating rabbit mortality at this time to make sure we aren't missing it by not looking. But I'm going to sort of pop it over to Julie so she can talk a little bit more about that outbreak in Ohio.
Yeah, thanks, Lynn. So going back to 2018, the first incursion of our HDV2 in the United States was in Medina County, Ohio. And it was a rural area, a man who owned 5 rabbits in a barn, domestic rabbits, and 4 of the 5 rabbits died. And they did investigation on that, found our HDV2, really never got to an explanation as to where that disease incursion came from. He didn't bring new rabbits in. There was no, herd movement. He didn't go to shows or things like that. And there was some wildlife surveillance in the surrounding area with nothing that really popped up. So that one is a little bit of a mystery as far as where that came from, but flared up and died in the same breath kind of thing. So we do believe it's possible our HDV2 could be in the area since we found it there before. And then going back to the Southwest outbreak, when we had the domestics detected in March of 2020, and then went back and spoke to more people, we realized in the surrounding area, and a pretty big surrounding area, from Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, there had been wild rabbit mortality events, and they were tested for plague and tularemia, the usual suspects, and those were negative, but we had not continued on. So when we then started going forward and testing further wildlife mortality events for RHDV2, we found it. So I can't say conclusively that the earlier events might have been, but it's certainly a possibility. So if you have unexplained mortality events and kind of test for the usual players and that's not it, please add RHD to your list if there are any future events, or if you see anything that's sort of unexplainable come this spring. I think that's a very reasonable thing to add to the testing protocol and to get those submitted into Plum. Thanks.
Just a quick comment to add on to that. This is not a subtle disease, so we don't feel there's very much chance that it's going to be smoldering. From what we've seen in the Southwest and what we know from the situation in Europe and the like, more than likely these are going to be fairly significant mortality events. And unless it's a pretty rural area, more than likely someone is going to bring it to our attention. At least that's my perception. Would you agree, Julia?
Agree.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, guys. You may have already touched on this, but Caleb has a question. Is there any concern with transfer to other animals?
Lagomorphs only. We're uncertain as to whether a pika, I guess you probably don't have pika in Ohio since they're high altitude, but the multiple lagomorph species. So there are a couple threatened or endangered species that we have not seen disease in, but it's the wild lagomorphs exclusively.
Just a little bit on that as well. One of the things that we're really concerned about is that this disease is we have a lot of virus in the environment, and this virus is very hardy. So we're concerned about in our normal course of diagnostics and the like, moving it from where it is to another location. So if you do have an outbreak or if you're working up cases, just be really careful with your biosecurity. You want to transport these animals in containers, and want to just be really careful that we are not really being accountable for actually moving the virus, because it is very, very contagious. Thank you.
Thanks. That's good information. Alan Lee wants to know, are you shocked at the rate of spread and the large area affected in the Southwest?
So this is Lynn. I'll take a first stab and others can jump in. If you noticed again in the early part of the presentation, it did spread really rapidly. It sort of looked like a bomb went off in the Southwest with just scattered detections everywhere. But if you look at the way this disease incubates and affects animals, it's really rapid. So from the time that they are infected until the time that they die can be between 1 and 3 days. So it is an agent that's sort of set up to spread really rapidly. And yes, it was alarming to sort of watch and be a part of.
Concur. Yeah, at the beginning, as the cases just kept rolling in and more detections, yeah, it's scary. And I think domestic rabbit owners are, the word terrified has come up, and people are quite alarmed and feel that there's a tsunami coming at them. And we're working really hard to try to up the game as far as individual owners. This is on the domestic side, recognizing the need for biosecurity, for cleaning and disinfection, for knowing the source of their hay and their feed, and not sharing equipment, and, avoiding unnecessary movement of other rabbits, all of those things. And then being aware also, as Tom said, we have a couple of cases that we can't really explain. And it might be as simple as being out hiking in an area where there was a wild rabbit mortality event and having it on your shoes, bringing it back in and introducing it to your domestics. So upping the game for biosecurity, and certainly for us, as far as wildlife professionals and veterinary professionals, being extremely cautious that we're not part of the problem and more part of this solution. So it is a good spreader. It's a pretty clever virus in that way.
Okay, thanks.
We discovered that our wild rabbits were susceptible back in 2017. So as the years went by, we thought, oh, maybe we dodged a bullet, and maybe it's not as bad as we thought. And then 2020 sure brought an end to that theory. So thank you.
Sarah Leonard wants to know, has there been any efforts to communicate with state's Department of Ag to provide information, awareness to be shared with fair boards and domestic show groups just to get the word out about this disease?
I can take that one, Sarah. So yeah, and I actually went back and counted in December, 31 times, in fact, I've spoken to. So we're in contact with NASAHO, the National Association of State Animal Health Officials, all of the state vets in the affected areas, and in fact, all of the state vets in the unaffected areas. I was asked to speak to the National Association of Fairs and Exhibits this summer. We gave guidance on biosecurity. And I guess if there's, a couple things that have been in our favor, ARBA, the American Rabbit Breeders Association, and the National Association of Fairs and Exhibits basically shut everything down this summer of 2020. Partly due to COVID, but partly due to RHDV. And yeah, we've made tremendous outreach. We've also talked to pet food companies, multiple rabbit industry groups. We're reaching out now to feed stores and to suppliers, Oxbow and other companies that supply specifically to small mammals like rabbits. So yeah, extensive outreach. I'm sure there's more to do, but we've worked really hard to get the information out to our accredited vets, to the, we spoke at USAHA, yeah, pretty well everywhere we could think of. But if you have further suggestions, please feel free to email me because I will follow up. Yeah, we've tried really hard to get the word out just to increase the state of awareness. The affected states know what's going on. It's the unaffected states that we really want to have kind of on alert. Thanks.
Yeah, Julie is our great communicator on this. And I'll just pop in and say, we also did some speaking with AFWA early on. And I think we'd also be interested if they are to continue to provide information through that group.
Thanks, guys. Great answer. So Alan has another question specifically for Tom. And he says, within the area of bounce back, are these animals or quote unquote survivors or animals breeding that had escaped the outbreak, or have they were they able to handle the virus?
Sorry, I was muted. That's a really good question. So we don't definitively know the answer to that. And we're planning on doing more research into the future to get to the bottom of it. But if I had to answer that question with what we've seen so far, I would be inclined to believe that those rabbits have seen the disease and they've developed some immunity to it. And the other thing that we know about released rabbit hemorrhagic disease, one, is it doesn't attack very young animals. We know that rabbit disease 2 attacks younger animals than 1, but still it does not appear that either of these viruses attack the very, very young. So it's also possible that two things are going on. We had animals that were exposed, that developed an immune response and survived, and also that we had
Well, Tom, you're frozen. Okay, well, since unfortunately Tom is frozen, I'm going to go ahead and move on for one more question, and then we can go ahead and move on. And then if you guys can share your contact information, I'm not sure if Cody or Caleb already has that, but if you can share your contact information in the chat so people can email you directly, that would be excellent. The last question is going to come from Lori Graber Brown. She said she did not get a chance to yet watch the presentations, but she wants to know, is there a time of year when the disease is more prevalent?
Lynn, do you want that one?
I'll give it a try. Lori, I don't think we have enough information yet to really know the answer to your question. And this disease started in March of last year, and it really sort of exploded through the spring and summer. And then we thought that it was slowing down, and we were hopeful that maybe there would be a seasonal component and that we'd get some relief in the colder months. But now we seem to be having more detections again as it continues to spread outward. So the ultimate answer is that we don't know, but we hope over time we'll know more. And I've seen just a few questions coming up more about, concern about other species. And I just want to emphasize again that this disease only affects lagomorphs, so only rabbits, hares, and we're concerned that possibly also pica, but not dogs, not cats, not you.
I do want to just quickly, I know that that was supposed to be our last question, but Mark Smith has a good comment here that I just want to bring up to the group. It's a question, then perhaps you can just quickly answer it. What materials are available to post at some of the auctions? Several Amish-based auctions sell a lot of rabbits, and outreach to that sector to be good. And that's a really good point, because that is a sector of our population that isn't in the mainstream, and so getting information to those populations would probably be a little bit more difficult.
It's a great question, and the USDA Center for Epidemiology and Animal Health has a good website. It has disinfection information. The cleaning and disinfection sheet, I think, is the most useful. It probably wouldn't apply to the Amish population, but we did have that document translated into Spanish as well, especially in the Southwest. That was necessary to really be clear in our communication. And we know that from other areas too. In the kind of Mississippi River Valley, we have a lot of populations that raise rabbits for meat, and Amish, and we've seen some Mennonite and Hutterite communities and some other that are a little bit more pocketed, and making some attempts to reach those has been in our checklist as well. So and in several states, honestly, I would peek around at a couple of the other states. Colorado, California have made some great little graphics and things like that. So you certainly don't have to start, from ground zero and recreate. There's some really good graphics up, but I'd send you to the USDA site. And then we have some links to some other sites as well. So it is important to try to reach those populations. And we also just have like 4-H and FFA kind of groups where we wanted to make sure that those kids who might be affected, and that's a big deal to lose a rabbit that you've been raising for show for a long time. So there's a lot of good material out there as far as outreach. And one more that I'll plug is the American Rabbit Breeders Association. ARBA.net has some really good resources as well, and they try to maintain very accurate information for their members. So that might be applicable to the Amish community. Thanks.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you,
You bet.
Tom. Thank you, Lynn. Appreciate you answering all those questions and taking your time to send us a video and get up early from Fort Collins, Colorado to be on Eastern Standard Time this morning. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Take care. I'll get the email in the link so anyone can follow up with us. Thanks a lot.
Flash the agenda up here again. Next, we're going to learn about some Maumee River lake sturgeon, and I'm going to let Alan Lee introduce our next presenter.
Good morning, everybody. I'd like to introduce to everyone Justin Shiott. Justin is a fish biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service at the Alpena Fish and Wildlife Conservation Office in that state up north. And more specifically, for this talk, it's work that was done out of their Detroit River substation in Trenton, Michigan. So welcome, Justin. The floor is yours.
All right. Thanks a lot. And thanks for inviting us to talk about lake sturgeon restoration in your meeting here this year. And, that on that initial slide that you just showed, Caleb, they're really, my name is on there, I guess, for leading and giving the presentation, but there's a lot of other people who have been involved with this work. And if you guys did get a chance to watch the video, there are at least 15 other names of folks who've been intimately involved with this, each providing kind of that unique niche that it takes to have a large-scale restoration program. And I know Dr. Matt Cross is on the phone today and with the Toledo Zoo, and the zoo has been an integral part in that process along with the state of Ohio. So I guess for a quick summary, I just wanted to tell folks the lake sturgeon is an endangered species in the state of Ohio, and currently, or historically, Lake Erie, it was estimated that there were anywhere from 300,000 to 1.1 million adult lake sturgeon in Lake Erie. So Lake Erie contained the highest number of lake sturgeon in the Great Lakes, probably due to the higher productive waters and just shallow waters of the lake. Right now, it's estimated, we have just recently calculated 2 population estimates, one for the Detroit River. We estimate that population is around 6,500 individuals. That includes subadults and adults. And folks in the eastern basin of Lake Erie have estimated the upper Niagara River population to be around 900 adult fish. And those are the only 2 locations where lake sturgeon populations exist right now that would allow fish to recruit into Lake Erie is the Detroit River, St. Clair Detroit River system, and the Niagara River. Historically, there were a lot of other populations and tributaries that supported lake sturgeon spawning, but right now it's only those 2. So only about 7,000 fish compared to hundreds of thousands likely historically. And this project is the first lake sturgeon stocking event in Lake Erie, which was in 2018 when we had the first event. That was we had a lot of people show up to the release ceremony, and it was a great event, celebrated by a lot of folks. And I think that is the streamside rearing component is pretty unique, right? Streamside rearing is just making sure that these fish are reared in native waters, and it's not really known yet whether or not fish that are reared in a traditional hatchery will come back to spawn like lake sturgeon do 20 years later. So there's a unique research component to this project as well. We have fish stocked into the Maumee River that are raised at the Toledo Zoo streamside rearing facility, and then from a traditional hatchery. And then we're going to compare adult return rates, 15, 20 years from now. So I guess that's a quick update.
We have a question from one of the student volunteers who works with our board, and she couldn't make it today, but her question is, how might the public release ceremony be translated in the context of non-aquatic species?
So I'm guessing that question is related to kind of the what components could be applied to any type of outreach program, or I guess maybe that's the way.
Sarah Leonard, do you want to expand on that for us real quick?
Oh, I don't know if I can elaborate on it because she had just texted me the question, so I'm not entirely sure if I can give you any extra context. So I'm sorry.
No problem. I mean, I can speak a little bit about it and maybe answer it. And Matt, if you have anything to add, feel free. One of the reasons this project was initially kind of, the state of Ohio had been thinking about restoring lake sturgeon, from my understanding, for quite some time. But one of the things that the group wanted to do when we initially met was to increase awareness about some of the water quality issues taking place in the Maumee River watershed. So it's coming from like an aquatic stewardship standpoint. So like just knowing that this unique iconic species is being stocked into the Maumee River, it might help. The release ceremony is also an opportunity for other groups who are involved with water quality issues around the Great Lakes or around the state of Ohio to come and share some of their stories and some other work that's going on. And I know the zoo has implemented a unique Adopt a Sturgeon program, which other sturgeon programs and release ceremonies around the Great Lakes are doing. And that, I think, is pretty cool and allows folks to kind of have some ownership in the project, right? So every one of these fish receives a pit tag. And so it's a unique identifier to that fish. We individually tag all 3,000 sturgeon that are stocked into the river each year, and people can adopt a sturgeon with that unique code. And if that fish is ever recaptured, years down the road, the recapture information will be sent to the person who adopted the fish. So I think the adoption program is pretty cool and could be applied, I think, to other non-aquatic species, but also just that stewardship component in raising awareness, obviously, as well.
Thanks. Hopefully that answers your question, Sarah. The next question comes from Caleb. And he said, in your presentation, you mentioned 17 different families. What is meant by this exactly?
So one of the goals of the program is to make sure that there is a high amount of genetic diversity into the fish that we are releasing. So the Great Lakes Fish Commission has developed, along with many other co-authors all around the Great Lakes, like sturgeon specialists, have developed the Great Lakes Lake Sturgeon Genetic Stocking Guidelines. And they have guidelines that they suggest for how many females and male sturgeon to collect eggs from in a given year to make sure genetic diversity is maintained. So the goal for our program is to have the highest amount of genetic diversity we can. And in that document, it was around 7 female lake sturgeon crossed with 4 males each year. So each year we target 7 females and 28 males. We collect a few more sturgeon than that because sometimes the females don't release their eggs and we might not. But a family just refers to 1 female and the male crossings. So, and we have been told by quite a few sturgeon folks that, you know, this program is kind of one of the programs where there is definitely a lot of females captured each year, and it's really genetically diverse. And all of the fish or eggs that we collect, they're collected up near Port Huron, Michigan, near Sarnia, Ontario, at the headwaters of the St. Clair River, right where Lake Huron flows into the St. Clair River. And that estimated population is around 20,000 fish right now, which is the largest lake sturgeon population with access to the Great Lakes. And so by collecting fish there, you know, we're hoping we do not influence, harm that population in any way. And we think that it's definitely large enough, so we're not doing that.
Thanks. And I think you also answered the next question, which was, what was the ultimate goal of the reintroduction program and increase biodiversity, harvestable populations? I think you just answered that.
Yep. The main thing, the state of Ohio was self-sustaining population, not stocking enough fish to harvest yet, but it was just to develop a self-sustaining population.
Perfect. Thank you. Nick Shell has a question. How many years do you anticipate continued stocking efforts to continue?
It'll likely take 20 to 25 years to reach the genetic diversity and also number of fish that we think need to be stocked based on the survival of the fingerlings that are stocked and then juvenile fish and adults. And we are conducting studies currently underway to assess the survival of the stocked fish. There's already a study underway looking at juvenile survival near the Detroit River mouth, which could be used as a surrogate for these juveniles. And then we know adult sturgeon survival is around 97%. You know, once those fish reach a meter in length, survival is pretty high. And that was through some acoustic telemetry work that was conducted and led by the U.S. Geological Survey. So what happens is you have to have 20 years because you don't want to miss a year class, basically, right? These fish are likely not going to return. The males might return 10 to 15 years down the road, but the females might not return to the Maumee River for 15 or 20 years. And so if you stop stocking, you'll have fish that literally don't return in some years either if you only had like a 10-year stocking program. So that's another reason for the longevity, I guess.
I have a quick question. This is Marcy, the voice with no face. What does the increased population do to the ecosystem of the water bodies you're increasing these populations? How does it help, hurt? Does it do anything to add, subtract, multiply, divide to the ecosystem and helping other species or what have you?
Yeah, I guess there's quite a few different ways to look at that. But like one question that we routinely get, and we have received anyway, is lake sturgeon are known to feed on zebra and quagga mussels, right? And so we've got the question before of, if the lake sturgeon populations increased a lot in the Great Lakes, could it do something to reduce the zebra and quagga mussels? We don't think that's the case. There was a case study done in Lake St. Clair where the population in Lake St. Clair and the St. Clair Detroit River system is quite high, and zebra mussels and quagga mussels became established, and even with those high populations. But they are an indicator of ecosystem health, along with a lot of other fish species. So I don't know if I guess that answered your question or not, but.
No, that's helpful. I was just curious if that, made any changes, good, positive, negative. The next question comes from Caleb. He said, in the hook and line survey, what kind of hook is used? Circle hooks? And do you expect mortality with this survey?
Yep, we used straight shank hooks. We use 1/0 and 9/0 size hooks. Other folks use up to 10/0 size hooks. We use smaller hooks to capture juvenile fish, and the larger 9/0 hooks for adults. And we do not, any of our set line surveys that we do, we don't have any mortality. We've caught thousands of lake sturgeon on set lines, and we have had, in the 10 years that I've done this work, I want to say 1 or 2 adult sturgeon mortalities. And that was a result of the sturgeon getting wrapped around the main line of the set line, not from the hook. It got wrapped around, and unfortunately, when the rope wrapped around the gills could no longer open. But this is set lining, which is commonly used for sturgeon, is great. There's no mortality and there's very little bycatch. Gill nets is another strategy that are used for sturgeon, but there's much more mortality, and you have to be on top of it a little bit more in regards to how long you want to let those nets set out there before you retrieve them. And certain states have set up policies where if you're doing sturgeon work and targeting sturgeon and using like gill nets, you can only set them for 2 hours, and you got to retrieve them in hopes of reducing mortality. But set lines are the gear to go to, in my opinion, depending on what your goals are.
Excellent answer. And thank you. Such great answers, such great questions. Really awesome presentation. Very cool. We're going to go ahead and need to move on to stay on schedule. So we really appreciate you coming to the Q&A and providing us with a presentation. I'm going to go ahead and throw it over to Caleb.
Thank you, Marcy. Thank you, Justin. I appreciate you providing us with that great presentation and answering our questions this morning. But we are going to move on. Here's our agenda. And next, we're going to learn a little bit about Blandings turtles. And I'm going to let Nick Shell introduce our next speaker.
Hey, everyone. I'd like to introduce Matt Cross from the Conservation Department at the Toledo Zoo and Aquarium, and invite questions for his presentation on the conservation status of the Blandings turtle within the Lake Erie watershed. So hopefully you guys have been thinking of some questions for Matt's presentation. I really enjoyed this one, and I'm looking forward to hearing some questions from the group. So Matt, it's all you.
Thanks. This is a really fun project, a lot of collaboration between ourselves, Ohio Biodiversity Conservation Partnership, Division of Wildlife, Michigan DNR, Michigan Natural Features Inventory, University of Purdue Fort Wayne, a lot of private property owners. We've had a lot of success. We're all very passionate and excited about this, and yeah, I'm very happy to entertain any questions folks might have.
Excellent, because you've already got one.
Oh.
So Sarah Zaleski wants to know, did all states use a standardized method for population analysis, or were multiple methods used?
So one of the nice parts about this is we used a method that was designed or piloted by the Northeast Blandings Turtle Working Group, coordinated monitoring strategy. So they had 5 states partner in the Northeast using the same kind of monitoring technique. We used that. We modified it slightly to fit our unique areas. But the nice part is we pretty much gathered the data the same way, so we can start making some direct comparisons between here and what we see in the Northeast. We've had conversations with them in terms of working together down the road to put our data together and start building towards some of these regional plans.
Thanks. And Sarah, if you have a follow-up to that, just type it on in there. Caleb has a question. How has the NRCS Working Lands for Wildlife program increased Blandings turtle population?
I'm not as familiar with that. We have been working with Nick Shell on ways to move forward with this. And part of our conservation plan is going to involve working with the NRCS to kind of do just that. So to work on increasing the Blandings turtle population through that partnership. I'm sure they already have it in their list. And Nick, I mean, if you want to chime in, I think it's one of their focus species. So really what we want to do is use our data, partner with them, and just increase the impact.
Right. Yeah, I'll chime in real quick, Matt. Essentially, it is a working land species, and we're kind of in a holding pattern right now until we get a good grasp on funding. But there is definitely room for technical assistance, and we hope to move that program forward in the near future.
Hey, thanks to both of you. Sarah Leonard has a question from our student, Denise. We have student volunteers that work with the board, Matt, and she couldn't make it, so she's texting her questions to Sarah. She wants to know, what are turtles harvested for in Ohio, and has that impacted Blandings turtle?
So the most the main species that is harvested in Ohio would be the snapping turtle for their meat. And we used to sell their eggs. I think that just changed, and there's been some update to shipping eggs overseas, but primarily for meat. Some people it's some subsistence, some people they sell it. To the best of my knowledge, it hasn't really impacted the Blandings turtles. The trappers that I have talked to, they talk about, the yellownecks they get in their traps and they just throw them back. They're not really of value. That isn't to say that there aren't people who are harvesting them illegally for the pet trade or for poaching. We do know that's an issue with some turtle species, particularly box turtles and spotted turtles. Blandings turtles are about in the same ballpark. But harvest in terms of for meat from the snapping turtles, I wouldn't imagine impacts the Blandings turtles, but that is something that we could look at down the road.
And she has another question. How long does Toledo Zoo, Ohio, plan to continue the current Head Start efforts?
That's kind of a moving target. So this was just our pilot year to get rolling. We're currently running some population models, looking at some of these sites to determine just that, how long we're gonna have to continue doing this. Most places, you're talking 10 or more years, just because you're limited by the number that you can put back in each season. So yeah, we're working to determine our end game, but we plan to do it for the foreseeable future, especially in these areas where we've been working for some sites. We've been doing surveys for more than 15 years, and we haven't seen a lot of recruitment. And then what was really interesting is being able to use these coordinated surveys in these really populated areas and these places that are kind of sparse. We can kind of say, like, well, now we've put in our legwork, and some of these areas need some help. And so we're gonna start there. We're gonna be monitoring the hatchlings with radio transmitters to look at survival, post-release survival and whatnot. And eventually we'll continue until our models tell us that we can get out of the game.
Great answer. I have a question, just to kind of follow up with that. Both OWMA and OCTWS, we work with students. One part of our mission is to provide opportunities for students to engage them, make them better wildlife professionals. Really all of our goals should be replacing ourselves with people who are going to do an excellent job after we can't do this work anymore. Do you have opportunities for students to come out? You've got such a lengthy program. Are there opportunities that we could send out to students who could come help you with field work and learn how to do that radio telemetry and learn how to do some of these assessments?
So that is something we've actually been having some internal conversations about getting better at. We do have some programs that exist right now. Like I do our local metro park. I've got the high schoolers doing turtle trapping for me. They really enjoy it. Not so much when they get snapping turtles, so I usually have to go out there and help them with those. We'll do Summer camp, there's our Summer Explorers camp with the zoo that we do. Essentially, students run through spend an entire week with me doing all the things that I would normally do. And then we're working with we just wanted to start this, working with our school partners like TPS to kind of do just this program. I think I'm gonna ruin the explanation or butcher the explanation, but especially like Penta and NSTC, these apprenticeship programs, trying to push those forward so that people throughout the state can do exactly that. If they're interested in this kind of thing, they can come get some experience. Because yeah, when applying for jobs down the road, there is definitely in our field a catch-22 of needing experience to get the job that you want to have the experience you need to get. So yes, if you want, you can get in touch with me if you have ways that we can promote that. Because right now, our focus is, up here in Toledo, but definitely, we could do this at a state level.
That would be excellent. And I think that Sarah Leonard and I would both probably reach out to you to explore some possibilities. We also have been dabbling and reaching out to high school age students. We mostly work with college students, in getting into their career fields. But, one of the things that came across us is getting involved with high school students because they may know where they want to be, and the earlier they can start, the better. So Sarah and I will probably reach out to you and come up with some ideas and see if we can't get some things going with you.
Excellent.
The next question, and thanks for that. That's excellent. Cody Grosser wants to know, what are their habitat requirements and what features do you recommend wetland restoration projects include to attract and support blandings?
So Blandings turtles are, wetland specialists, obviously. They tend to favor these complex habitats where they need an interconnected wetland patches, upland habitat. And so early season ephemeral pools are really good because that's where they're getting tadpoles, they're basking, and then these semi-permanent wetlands. And so what we've tried to do, especially in Northwest Ohio, particularly the Oak Openings region, is promote habitat that is large. And I will hand wave to say that I would need to do some work to figure out what large actually means, but larger the better. So in the Lake Erie marshes, we have these stable populations with these large semi-natural wetland areas compared to sites where we don't have those. And so in my slideshow, one of the things we do with Metro Parks is we just making a wetland that would retain water year round, because a lot of times what happens is these ephemeral pools, they dry up. And then through our telemetry, we've seen that they then just kind of ping pong around the area to backyard ponds, and that puts them at increased risk of road mortality. So just having something large enough that is attractive is great. And then structure, retaining water, these are all important things. One of the things we did years ago for our first actual O-Park meeting, we brought Justin Cogden. He's like the godfather of Blandings turtles. He's from ES George Reserve, or he worked at ES George Reserve at U of M. I think they've had a population study going up there for more than 50 years. And that was one of his comments, where these places in Ohio where, okay, this looks great. Over here, not so much. Here's what they could use. And so we've really just tried to push that with our partners. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, that was a very great answer. And then building on that, you mentioned road mortality. Caleb Shields wants to know, how has vehicle mortality affected the populations? And, especially in states like Ohio, we are very road centric and we cut through lots of, very nice habitats. I will just say I work for DOT, so you can be mad at me if you want.
Oh no, that's so we in general we know roads are detrimental to turtle populations because the females are the ones that make the long distance movements, and so then they're more susceptible to road mortality. In particularly the Blandings turtle, we suspect that road mortality plays a role in the declining populations. We find them head on the road each year, but to the extent that vehicle mortality affects these populations that we know of is kind of a question mark. And so that's something that we would hope to address with some of these things. I will say that, so that we did some distribution models for this, and I've done distribution modeling in the past. And when you start looking at roads, it kind of turns out that, road, if you so distance to road, if you use that as a predictor, it might show you that that's favorable just because they're so ubiquitous on the landscape. And so we do know that roads influence these populations. They can often be attractive because they're open, warm areas, and the turtles will either bask or lay their eggs next to roads. So again, we do suspect that roads are impacting these populations, but to what extent remains unclear. And those are some of the other questions we hope to answer with some research down the road.
Well, I will definitely be following up with you about that.
Yeah.
That's one of my passions is road ecology. And I know it sounds like an oxymoron, but it is a real thing.
Oh no, and it is. It's really important with our turtle species is managing them within the context of these roads. And it is something that's very important to consider. So it's an aspect of this that we hope to explore down the road as we build off this project.
Great. The next question comes from Mark Wiley, and he says, although not your main topic, you discussed Ohio's size limit for snapping turtles harvest and mentioned it may protect mature females. Do we know much about capture-related mortality of undersized snapping turtles after their release? Specifically, do turtles caught by bank lines or float lines survive after swallowing a hook? Sorry for going off topic a bit.
No, not at all. To the first point, do we know much about capture mortality of undersized snapping turtles after the release? Or no, I guess that is both the same thing. So yeah, if you catch a snapping turtle on a hook, that's something I've always been curious about, and I have done a poor job of following up on this. Reading papers where the hooks, if you just cut the line, they can stay in their gut, and you can just X-ray turtles and get an idea of how many fish hooks they've ingested over the years. And it's a project that I've always wanted to pull the trigger on around here. It's really hard to work with, the only way I can do is bring snapping turtles back to the lab and X-ray them. And that seems a little bit more of a stressor than I want to put on them for that. But not really sure. I know there's been some work on it and they do retain those. And in some cases it can cause, some internal damage and mortality. But, yeah, the survival after they ingest a fish hook, I think is anyone's guess right now.
Okay, thanks. And sorry to end your Q&A on snapping turtles, but they're still awesome. And
oh no, and that's the nice part about this is our focus is Blandings turtles, but we get a lot of really good data on these other species as bycatch, and so we can answer a lot of different questions, and it's pretty awesome.
Very good, very excellent presentation. Really appreciate your time today. We're going to go ahead and throw it back over, and Sarah and I will be in touch on multiple things.
Thank you, Marcy, and thank you, Matt. Great presentation that we were able to upload, and thank you for answering our questions this morning. But again, we are going to move on. Here's our agenda, and next we're going to learn about some urban archery hunting programs. And I'm going to let Marcy Leininger introduce our next speaker.
Thanks, Caleb. So I'd like to introduce the wonderful Laura Graber. She's a wildlife professional with the Ohio Division of Wildlife, and she's going to give us some insights on perceptions versus reality and things that she's finding that assist the decision-making process for urban archery hunting programs. Sarah, sorry, your name's not Sarah, Laura. I'm talking to lots of people at once. Laura, we really appreciate your time this morning, and I'm going to go ahead and throw it on over to you.
All right. Thank you, Marcy. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep, you're being heard very well.
Okay. Well, thanks for taking the time to watch my presentation. The reason why we decided to do this presentation was because here especially in Northeast Ohio, but not just in Northeast Ohio, throughout the state and across the country, urban areas and municipality leaders are starting to see the need to control deer herds in their municipalities. So we decided to, take this on and send out a survey to all of Ohio city leaders to kind of get their thoughts and answers on what kind of issues they've dealt with since they've instated a hunting program. So that's kind of the short of the presentation, and I'd be glad to take any questions that anybody has.
Excellent. Sarah Zaleski has a question. She says, do you have any information on successful programs that have ended because deer numbers were controlled, or have all programs continued in an effort to keep deer numbers in check?
Actually, Sarah, I think when we conducted the survey, there were a couple of cities. I can think of one particularly that had ended their program because they decided that they no longer wanted to deal with the monetary aspect of the program and felt like it was taking up too much of their time. Other than that, I'm not familiar with any other programs that have ended.
And I have a question. Are you getting much pushback from communities in regard to safety, pets and children and things of that nature that can always come up in these kinds of situations?
Absolutely. I mean, that's something we deal with all the time. No matter what the issue is, whether it's deer issues or nuisance goose issues, we certainly do get a little pushback from residents in cities in cities where they're wanting to open it up to hunting. And some city leaders are reluctant to push forward with the program because of the pushback that they're getting from their residents.
We're actually going to go ahead and switch moderators here real quick. Nick Shell is going to take the next question.
Okay.
Yeah, and the next question is actually mine, so that's perfect timing. So has there been any effort to quantify the positive effects in terms of dollars saved via average decrease in damage as a means to communicate benefits to the program to municipalities? Essentially, has there been a monetary value placed on it?
Yeah, that's a tough one, Nick. I think Jeff Westerfield is on here. If you're willing to chime in, Jeff, maybe you have an answer to that question.
Yeah, I think the answer to that is no. And I think that's something that is just seen across the country. And that was some of the basis here is that really we have no quantifying of anything up to this point. When we look at these programs, it's just a lot of do it and you should see positive results. But these communities that are having whether it be in landscape damage or whatever, there's never been any quantifying of that. And some of that boils back to, I think what some of Lori pointed to in her presentation is that there's really no standard, no expectation of quantifying those things when programs begin. And that's probably a future need as we deal with communities, is to have some level of quantification of those effects, both negative and positive.
Thanks. I have another question in the chat box. Does the Division of Wildlife have any publications to provide to cities to help them build their hunting programs?
We have a publication. It's Ohio Technical Management Guide, Urban White-tailed Deer. Mainly what the publication covers is how to deal with deer conflicts in the city. And it does, in the end, cover, what the options are if they want to start a hunting program. That's the only publication, to my knowledge, that we have.
Okay.
And that actually was put together by Jeff Westerfield.
Another question here from Alan. Do you plan to revisit the survey later? If so, when do you plan to do so and how often?
Well, good question, Alan. Yes, this is something that Jeff and I have talked about continuing on with, and maybe doing it on a every other year. I guess maybe conduct the survey every other year to see, how have things changed? Is everything, as far as incidents go, is everything staying the same? Are they increasing, decreasing? So I think that's kind of our plan at this point, is hopefully to continue on with the survey, maybe get more cities involved, because there were cities that we know have hunting programs that did not answer our survey.
So the next question in the chat box is pretty long, and I'm going to kind of summarize it, but essentially it's addressing the public perception of urban hunting. And have you found, or misconception rather, but have you found that there's a most effective way to facilitate these discussions with the public and have the most accurate information presented to residents in the areas where these are being these efforts are taking place?
That's a good one. I think that the main the main thing is to be open to the public, you know, hence when they have wildlife council meetings, a lot of times we will attend those meetings to help address any concerns, because a lot of times city council members don't have the correct answers, or they're not familiar enough with deer hunting to know how to properly answer people who are concerned about hunting. So, you know, on that end, yes, we do help out with those meetings when they do occur, and we're there typically. So I don't know if that really answered the question or not.
Okay. Yeah, I think it addressed part of the question. I think it was more aimed at just these areas across the state where it's taking place. Everyone places a different value on wildlife, and in some people's perception of it being a nuisance is different than others. I think that's what it was driving at. So that's a good question. I have another question from Ray out in Oklahoma. Are there parts of the state where deer are more likely to eat up gardens, or is this a huge problem throughout the entire state?
Well, I mean, I think anywhere in the state of Ohio, if anybody has a garden, deer certainly will take advantage of that. But yes, I certainly do.
You froze there for a second. Maybe try turning your camera off to reduce bandwidth.
Oh, while she's froze up, I'll finish up with, yeah, I mean, we see these problems all
Thanks,
throughout
Jeff.
Ohio, even in rural communities, you know, rural cities, I guess, if you want to call them. There's no particular, you know, nook or cranny of the state that's worse than another.
And then I got one last question. And Jeff, feel free to help answer this if she's still frozen.
Yep.
In your incident charts of your presentations, are sociological incidents such as people just reporting seeing a hunter included in that graph? So just the chart where it's talking about, you know what I'm referring to, Jeff, but
yep.
The chart talking about people's perception of the program and just visualization on people and hunting in the area.
Yeah, and that's one of one of the negatives of you know, putting a presentation together and then having your face on there is you lose a corner of the presentation. So yeah, the chart I think was cut off a little bit, but that was one of the things that she looked at, was looking at, you know, just the number of people that were seen, you know, by the residents and reporting to the city, to have an idea of how often that occurs, which was towards the higher, you know, if you want to term the more likelihood of an incident occurring, that was at the higher level of things going on. And, you know, and some of this is, you know, I think getting at some of the communication of some of this information is then utilizing some of that in decision-making process for setting up a program. If we know that that's a high issue, you know, how can we address some of that with setting up programs in the community?
Okay, great, thanks. Well, I think that wraps up the questions in the chat box. I want to throw it back over to Caleb and move on to the next item in the agenda.
Thank you, Lori, and thank you for filling in there, Jeff. Great work, great presentation, and thanks for answering our questions this morning. Again, we are going to move along here. Here's our agenda, and next we're going to get an update on Ohio bat populations, and I'm going to let Sarah Zaleski introduce our next speaker.
Good morning. I'm going to introduce Sarah Stankovic, a wildlife professional with the Ohio Division of Wildlife. She presented a populations and implications for habitat management update on bats in Ohio. So Sarah, I will let you if you want to give a short summary, you can, and Nick will answer Nick will take the questions that come in. So feel free to put any questions you have for Sarah in the chat box.
Perfect. Thanks, Sarah. So thank you to the group for letting me or inviting me to give an update. So kind of some big things happened in the bat world over the last year. At the state level, we listed two new species and upgraded one of our species. So we now have 4 bat species that are listed as state endangered. So I was happy to be able to give you an update on populations and how we came to that conclusion, share some information about the impacts of white nose syndrome, and hopefully you guys found that useful. So I'm anticipating some bats and COVID questions, potentially also another big thing going on in the bat world. But just while we're waiting for a couple of questions here, I just wanted to plug, we had our bat working group meeting yesterday. Had a lot of really great presentations about some research that's been going on in Ohio and in some other states. If you weren't able to attend that, we did record it and it'll be up on the Bat Working Group website shortly. So if you're interested, you can look for that there in a couple days.
Great. Thanks, Sarah. I'm going to jump right into the first question, which is from Sarah Leonard. And she says, first of all, she's a big fan of your work. Awesome. She's got a question from our student volunteers. So what implications does the federal listing have for state resources for helping bats? And have you been coordinating with any neighboring states?
I don't know so much about what it'll mean, money-wise for us to be able to get any more resources. They do right now have, I don't know if it's every year, they put out a white nose syndrome grant. I believe I mentioned that in the presentation. We did just apply for one of those and get a grant to do some more work on tricolored bat research. We've been doing a cave, our hibernacular surveys were also a white nose syndrome grant from the feds as well. So we do have those opportunities. Whether or not that's going to open up more opportunities, I certainly hope so. We'd be happy to be able to expand our research and to look more. As it comes to coordinating with other states, we have been working, or I shouldn't say we, but Dr. Joseph Johnson from OU has worked a lot with Greg Turner from the Pennsylvania Game Commission. They've been doing some studies over there that we're now replicating here in Ohio, specifically testing this chemical called PEG, which is potentially going to be able to be used to treat white nose syndrome in some specific environments. So we're bringing some of that into Ohio. I mentioned we have those acoustic surveys. We're transitioning that to a new protocol, and that's from the North American Bat Monitoring Network. So this is going to be a new network, or is a new network, where we can all share data. We're all doing the surveys the exact same way, so that we can put all the data in this database, and then we're going to be able to look at trends, not just here in Ohio, but also at a regional and nationwide scale. So hopefully more of that coordination is coming.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The next question, are all bat species equally susceptible to the white nose fungus syndrome? And colony bats just more likely to spread the disease? Are colony bats more likely to spread the disease, or are some bats less susceptible?
Yeah, so there are differences in what bats are susceptible to white nose. So the ones that are most susceptible are actually the ones that are going to be hibernating in the caves during the winter. So we've got two groups of bats. Some of them migrate. We've got 4 species that will migrate south, and then the rest of them will hibernate in the caves. So the fungus itself actually likes the cold, so it grows in those cave environments, and when the bat's body temperature drops, it can then colonize the bats. So those 4 species that are migratory, they've been shown to actually, they can get the fungal spores on them, but because their body temperatures are never dropping the same way as they are in the other species, they don't actually get white nose syndrome. So they can be implicated in sort of carrying the fungal spores all around without actually getting the disease. And then within those cave bats, there are ones that seem to be more susceptible, but it seems to be at this point more related to body size. So if you're a really small bat and you're kind of on that razor thin margin in the winter, and you get this disease, you're going to burn through that body fat really quickly, and you're going to be more likely to die. Whereas larger bodied bats are more likely to make it through the winter.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Next question I have. So you mentioned that the feds consider wind energy impacts as well as white nose syndrome when evaluating long-term impacts to bats. We all know how bad white nose syndrome is, but just how bad is the wind energy impact if it is being used as a major consideration by the feds?
Yeah, so I don't know that I'm the most qualified. We actually have a separate wind energy biologist, Erin Hazelton, who handles most of that. I can say that they're impacting different species. So while the white nose syndrome is impacting the cave bats, the wind energy is impacting those migratory species, because most people don't know that there are migratory bats, but some of them are moving very long distances. So they're moving through the middle part of the country. They're moving through the areas in Ohio where we have wind energy. And again, it's not just here in Ohio, but other states that might have more wind energy. So it's sort of looking at those two different groups of bats, and one is being impacted by one thing and one is being impacted by another. So you need to factor both of those things in to get a picture of what's going on as a whole. And I don't want to call out Erin. I do see she's here, but if you have anything to add.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I was waiting to see if you wanted me. I think that was a great explanation. So Sarah mentioned I oversee the review of wind energy development in the state of Ohio as far as it relates to wildlife impacts. And I think what we found is that wind turbines are really good samplers of whatever is using the airspace. And so certainly that includes bats as well as some birds. So if there is a bat flying around, there is a risk. And as far as, how big is the risk, especially to these rare species, I mean, that's really the question, is how many do we really have left, and what are the chances that they're going to come into run into a wind turbine? And that's what the feds are trying to figure out, just to see if it really is a risk that we really need to address with the wind companies moving forward.
Thank you, Erin.
Great, thanks for that additional information. Let's say I have one last question here, and that's from Marcy. So ODOT has avenues for research. Has there been any thought to reaching out to ODOT to do Ohio white nose research?
We would certainly love to coordinate with anybody who would like to. We are working with ODOT. I'm working with ODOT on an artificial roost project. So ODOT had some leftover money from the bat tunnel gating project that they were able to use for any types of bat conservation. So we, in partnership with a bunch of the divisions here, we're doing an artificial roost project at Houston Woods and Malabar Farms, where we put up 3 different types of bat boxes. Then we're going to be doing some temperature logging, some guano monitoring, some emergence counts to see if bats are using, or what types of boxes they're using, what types of environments they're using them in. So that's a great partnership with ODOT. I know ODOT is also partnering with Joe Johnson at OU, and we're involved in that a little as well in the tunnel research. So we do kind of have an existing relationship with ODOT and bat research. And so anything else that you would like to collaborate on, we're definitely open to it.
Great. And I did have another, go ahead, Marcy.
I was going to say, feel free to reach out to me directly if you want to chat. Maybe you and Kate, you want to chew on some stuff and see if we can't come up with something. We have specifically research funds available that's separate from the funds you're talking about.
Okay. Yeah, that would be great. Thank you.
And then Sarah had another question come in. How successful are bat houses, and what are some of the BMPs for installation and maintenance of these?
Yeah, so that's what we're hoping to find out a little bit with this project. Bat houses can really be hit or miss. The bats are really picky, and there's a whole bunch of factors that go into it. So a lot of times I'll have people call me and I've got 20 acres of wooded habitat and I want to put a bat house. Well, you can, great. We'll encourage it. We'll help you out, but the bats are probably going to just be living in your trees. If they've got natural roosts, a lot of times they're going to choose those, at least, and when it comes to the endangered species. Bat boxes are really the most successful for big brown bats. Those are the types that you're going to get in your attic, in your barn, in buildings. So they'll pretty much roost anywhere that's suitable for them. So if you have a need for roosting area or roosting places in where you are, then bat boxes can be very successful. In terms of BMPs, there's a lot out there, but just briefly, they need a lot of sunlight. So you want to place them generally facing south or southeast or east. So they need about 7 to 9 hours of direct sunlight a day. They really like it to be about 80 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit inside that box all the time. It helps with the development of the young. And they also need to be pretty high off the ground. So when bats take off, they need some space to be able to drop down before they can fly. So generally the recommended is at least 8 feet, but it's preferred if you can do 10 to 15 feet is even better. Either put them on the side of a house or put them on a pole. We don't recommend that you put them on trees because it's easier for predators to then get up inside that box if they were around. So those are some quick things. There's a really great guide from Bat Conservation International. If you just Google, I believe it's Bat House Builder's Handbook, you'll get a link to a free PDF that you can download. It's like a 30-page guide of different bat box plans and how to choose where and how to install your bat box.
Okay, and then I did have one more question, and this will be the last one before we move on. Since you mentioned COVID at the beginning of your presentation, has the public had a lot of concern with bats and COVID in Ohio? And is there any certain box design that's best?
Yeah, so we didn't get as much COVID concern from the public as I was expecting. Actually, we got, bats have always been kind of maligned a little bit, and we were doing really well with kind of changing that reputation post white nose. And I was really afraid that people would start hating them again post COVID, but it doesn't seem like that's the case, at least for the general public. So that's great. We do get some concerns. We did just have somebody present at our meeting yesterday. They tested 20 different guano samples from several different species of bats, didn't find COVID being shed in any of those samples. And I know the National Wildlife Health Center out of Wisconsin is also putting together a publication. They did a study on big brown bats and also found that they were not, didn't seem to be susceptible to COVID. So that's some good news for the bats particularly, and also hopefully can alleviate some of the concerns from the public. And then last thing, the bat box designs. There's a lot of different designs out there. And again, one of the things we're trying to do is see if there's a different design that works for different species. There's one called a rocket box that in other areas seems to work really well for those endangered northern long-eared bats. There's one called Brandon bark that it's like an artificial bark that our Indiana bats seem to like. So it kind of depends on the target species. I will say that the most common plans you're going to find are what's called a nursery box, or sometimes it's called a bachelor pad. And that's just typically like the square rectangular one that you're going to see. If you do follow those plans, I would suggest that you always build one that has multiple chambers inside. So you'll see some that are just, one big open space in the middle. That really doesn't give the bats a lot of options to move around to thermoregulate. So having a bunch of chambers is helpful. If they're right in the front and it gets too hot, they can sort of move to the back where it's going to be a little bit cooler. It also can provide you just with a larger colony, can support a larger colony size. So that's probably my recommendations for that.
Thank you so much. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Caleb to lead us on through the presentations.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you, Sarah. Thank you for that excellent video that you provided us with, and thank you for taking your time this morning to answer everyone's questions. Again, we are going to move along here. Here's the agenda for today, and next we're going to learn a little bit about fire and grazing and butterflies in their habitat, and I'm going to let Sarah Leonard introduce our next presenter.
Hi, everybody. So Ray Morans is a pollinator ecologist with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation and a partner biologist with USDA and Nrcs. He provided his fantastic presentation on the effects of fire and grazing on butterflies and their habitat. And Ray, I'm really sorry that I didn't have a cool butterfly sweater to wear, but I'm hoping that my bees and my ladybugs impress you. I really think that your presentation was awesome. So if you guys have any questions for Ray, please drop those in the chat box.
Wow, thanks for that wonderful introduction. Thank you so much. I guess I'll try video and we'll see if it works.
We got you.
Good morning.
Loud and clear, and we can see you, Ray.
Good morning, and I have some opening comments. For those of you who saw my talk, you will have noticed that I had very few Ohio examples, and that's because I haven't been to Ohio since I was 8 years old. And as I shared with Nick, that was just on a drive-through and we got stuck in horrible traffic outside of Columbus, like the worst traffic ever. But that was a long time ago. So if you know of people in Ohio doing work on grazing or fire, please let me know, because I would like to expand my base of knowledge eastward. In fact, I'm working today on a document for Nrcs, the National Range and Pasture Handbook. And we're writing a chapter on pollinators. And I know a lot about range, but very little about improved pasture. And I know Ohio is not a range state, but you're a pasture state. So I'd love to hear of any research y'all know of fire and grazing in Ohio. Thanks.
Great. Well, Ray, while we're waiting on some other folks to put stuff in the chat box, I've got a question here. So for landowners and managers and land managers that are already planning prescribed burning for part of their pasture, as you laid out in your presentation, so I think you mentioned breaking it in thirds. So folks that are already planning those BMPs for controlled burn, are there any other measures that can be taken prior to prescribed fire on grazing lands? Essentially, are there other resources available for planners to consider?
But besides fire, or?
Well, in preparation for the fire, because I know you mentioned that you recommend in your presentation not burning an entire pasture area or rangeland at once, breaking into thirds or something of that nature.
Yep.
In addition to that measure, are there other precautions that can be taken or considered?
Okay, that's a great question. I don't think I've been asked that before. That's really one of the main ones that we think about. And I know we're going to burn my land. I say my land. My wife hates it when I say that. We're going to burn our land this year, maybe next month. It's going to be really scary because it's going to be right next to the house. So hopefully you don't burn the house down. But yeah, the big time consideration is really how much of it you burn. Now, well, actually, now I'm getting where you're going. The seasonality is really important. So some folks at NRCS think pretty strongly that I should burn in summer, because if you burn in summer, you help certain nectar plants come up in the fall for monarch migration. But if you burn in the winter or early spring, you help some of our milkweeds do better in the spring. And in my case, I live right next to a busy road, and we think that a winter burn will put less smoke on the road. So smoke considerations, for anybody doing prescribed fire are a big deal. And so the seasonality of when you burn. But other than that, we don't do a lot of different things. When it comes to pollinators, they don't change burning that much, except really make it a lot more important to just burn a portion, because folks, we are pretty darn sure that some rare butterflies have been eliminated from places, maybe even eliminated from states due to prescribed fire. And that should be avoided.
Thanks. Question in the chat box. Would you advise landowners who have small pasture for cattle on their land to plant milkweed in the pasture, or should they be avoided?
That is a fantastic question. Obviously, we risk a little legal liability if we advise them to plant something and their cattle get sick due to the toxins. But if you saw my talk, one of the most fun parts of this research is milkweed diversity, and some of the milkweeds are amazingly toxic. It turns out Ohio does have Asclepias viridis in southern Ohio, but for the most part, most of the milkweeds that have been analyzed thus far from Ohio are not very toxic. So whereas the South has many extremely toxic ones, and then the Southwest, extraordinarily toxic ones out in the desert. So yes, I would advise landowners in Ohio who wanted to help pollinators to try some of the low toxicity milkweeds, like butterfly milkweed. And my bigger fear, I wouldn't fear much for the cattle, I would fear for the plants. My bet would be that if you planted butterfly milkweed in your cattle pasture in Ohio, that either the cattle would leave them alone and the plants would do fine, or the cattle would eat the plants out of existence, and the cattle would do fine, but the plants would suffer. So yes, I met an animal scientist in West Virginia, obviously right next door to you folks. He said he does recommend to pasture owners to plant common milkweed because he has noticed that cattle love it. So common milkweed does have a little bit of toxin, but not very much. I might try that, but butterfly milkweed is extremely low in toxin.
Great, thanks for that detailed response.
Too much, sorry.
No, it was good. I didn't realize that we had some of the lower toxicity levels in Ohio, so that's good to know. So the next question is, controlled burning has many detractors within the eco community. So what do you think is the best approach to educating these folks so burning will become more acceptable practice in the future?
Well, that's a great question. In my neck of the woods, we don't deal with that as much. Obviously people are afraid of getting their homes burned, roads smoked out, but the ecologists here pretty much get the idea that the fire is really important. You know, one obvious thing is to point out that our predecessors on this landscape were burning for hundreds of years. And a huge number of our species are well adapted to that disturbance. That's certainly true in Oklahoma, where the bison herds actually followed the fires. If you've looked at that research here in the Great Plains and know anything about fire and its effects on plants, the plants that come up after a burn tend to be, of course, very young and very fresh and very nutritious. And so grazing animals like cattle or historically bison would follow, would travel around the Great Plains to find areas that had been burned. But Ohio also had burning, less burning probably than Oklahoma and Iowa, but still had burning. Even where I grew up in Western New York had some prescribed, some burning by the Native Americans. And again, plants, boy, the great majority of forbs at least are well adapted to fire. Obviously there are some trees, I think maples and beech that can't handle fire, but those are the trees that are increasing in the eastern forests because of the absence of fire. We need to get fire back into a lot of these places to restore our oaks and many of our other fire adapted species.
Great. So the next question is, I know in your presentation you talk about how fire increases blooming and has low mortality, especially when done in sections. But have you noted any impacts to species that overwinter that may be impacted during the winter or early spring burn?
So the main species I studied, the regal fritillary, you know, that one overwinters. And so I thought that I would find a lot fewer of them in the burned areas. And I did not. I found more of them in the areas that had a winter and spring burn. And I don't know, I can't prove why that happened, but I think the evidence suggests, well, let's see. My guess is that the regal fritillary caterpillars and some other rare butterflies got incinerated by our fires, by our winter fires. But the positive effects of the fires on the blooming caused them to come in from neighboring areas. You know, obviously you had the negative effect of the fire causing some direct mortality, but hopefully, seemingly that's counterbalanced by the positive effects of stimulation of the nectar sources. Certainly, I've been in areas that haven't had fire in a long time, and the wildflower abundance can be extremely low. And then you do a burn, and wham! There's so many more floral resources for the bees and butterflies. So, so that's my experience. Ann Swengel from Wisconsin, who is really the grand old dame of fire research and butterflies. And her work inspired me to go into my line of work. She's found really negative effects of fire, winter fire on rare butterflies. But I think the difference was she usually was doing her research in the upper Midwest, where the prairies tend to be a lot smaller. I do a lot of work, Missouri, Kansas, Oklahoma, where we tend to have larger prairies. So when you burn a portion of the prairie here, there's still other prairie where the rare butterflies are surviving. But in her case, a lot of the fires, they burned an entire unit, and it was surrounded by corn and soy, and there was no surrounding unburned area surrounding it where rare butterflies could take refuge. So that's my answer to that.
Another question in the chat box. So as you're aware, there's been a lot of talk about bird populations, especially grassland birds. So in recent years, so has there been any consideration for incorporating measures or connections for grassland birds in your work, since they overlap in a lot of the same areas?
Every major study I did, there was a grassland bird study or two going on at the same time. And I had intended to work with the bird people and come up with some sort of papers that would link our findings, but I never did. And that's more my fault than theirs, because they are more productive publishers than I am. The one important thing to point out is that the butterflies, the birds care a lot about structure. So the prescribed burning and grazing regimes that we would have would increase habitat heterogeneity by creating areas of different structure on the landscape. You had short areas with very short grass, areas with medium height grass, areas with tall grass. It's all a tall grass prairie community, but of course, right after a fire or right after heavy grazing, you get some areas that are very short. And you have bird species that like the short veg, and you have birds that like the high veg. With the butterflies, the rare butterflies don't care as much about structure, in my opinion, as they do about plant composition and whether or not things are blooming. So if you have really heavy grazing that's creating low structure, you usually have almost no flowers, and therefore the rare butterflies were not doing well in those areas. But your question's a wonderful one, and there should someone should publish something on that. But I don't think. Well, I certainly haven't. I wish I had.
Great, thank you. I have another question here and related to monarchs. So if monarchs were to be listed as federally endangered, how would this impact public-private land management for critical habitat protection? Example, could more burns be advised, permitted to promote milkweed production, less mowing on the sides of highways, etc.? I know this is kind of a complicated subject, but yeah.
It's an extremely complicated subject. Listing of the monarch. I used to work for Fish and Wildlife Service as an endangered species biologist. And the species I worked with were local endemics in Northern California. That was complicated enough. The listing of the monarch, which I shouldn't comment on given my position with NRCS. It's not our job to do that. But listing of the monarch certainly would be fascinatingly complex, because fire can hurt monarchs and fire can help monarchs. Grazing can help, grazing can hurt. So the complexity of designing a listing rule to help address the both positive and negative effects of disturbance would be a really fun challenge. I would enjoy working on that, but that's U.S. Fish and Wildlife.
And with that, I think Marcy has some additional comment that she might be willing to interject to add to that question. She works for ODOT here in Ohio.
I also used to work for the Fish and Wildlife Service in Ohio. And Ray, you worked for the Fish and Wildlife Service, so you're probably well aware of this. Under Section 7 in the Environmental Services Division of U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, that is where a lot of the implementation of the endangered species, all of the things that you can and cannot do, all the policy, that's where it kind of runs through. And under Section 7 of the Endangered Species Act, there's always some give and take, compromise, negotiations on, what resource agencies need to do in the face of a listing of a species. And so for the monarch, I can speak specifically to Ohio. We have the CCAA agreement that ODOT has entered into with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which is conservation. I'm just going to blank on that because I always have a hard time remembering it. Conservation plan with assurances, which, if you think about DOT, we have to mow our grass. We are changing those things. We are changing those measures, those timeframes, changing how we are doing business out on the side of the road within that agreement to try and bolster stems for milkweed, try and bolster habitat for other species that could utilize the roadside. So under Section 7, we have these abilities to work with action agencies and to work with resource agencies even for, trying to conserve and do land management. So there are ways that you can work around that. But it's a pretty tedious process. One of our hopes through this being in the CCAA agreement is that we wouldn't have to do formal consultation with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service every time we need to mow the grass.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we would never mow the grass. So I don't know if that helps, but there are ways to the means.
Great. Thanks for interjecting the additional information, Marcy. With that, Ray, I think that wraps up the questions we've got in our chat box, and really appreciate the presentation. And I know we plan to use your presentation for some future trainings with our grazing specialist here in Ohio. So
Great.
Thanks a lot. With that, I'll turn things back over to Caleb.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Ray. Again, thanks for your presentation. Thanks for your time this morning. Tuning in from Oklahoma, that's great. And thanks for your answering our questions. That does wrap up our Q&A session today. And before we end this conference, I would like to say a big thank you to all of our poster presentation submissions. The videos that these students produced were great, and we really appreciate them taking the time to share their research with us. If you haven't taken the time to view all these poster presentations yet, please do. These students did a wonderful job. Normally, in an in-person conference, it would be difficult for all of us to see all these posters, but with this new format, it's been really good. And last night during our business meeting, we discussed pursuing this in the future, even if we do in-person conferences, allowing these students to do both gives them a platform to permanently share their research digitally. So again, thank you to all the poster submissions. Again, thank you to all of today's presenters and participants, and thanks to OWMA partners, Division of Wildlife, the Ohio Division of Wildlife, Ohio Pollinator Habitat Initiative, and the Ohio chapter of the Wildlife Society. These three partners do a great job in helping us promote this conference and our association, and we really appreciate that. I'd also like to remind everyone that we will be sending out a link to all of our members for the post-conference survey. And for any non-members wishing to partake in that survey, there will also be a link posted on our webpage and on our Facebook page as well. So if you'd like to participate in that survey, please be looking out for that. We would appreciate all your comments, especially with this new platform that we pursued this year. We would greatly appreciate your feedback. And lastly, I'd like to thank my board members with all of their assistance with planning this conference. And as my duties as president for 2020, I've received a lot of help along the way, and it definitely couldn't have been done without them. So thank you. With that, I'll kind of open up the floor to other board members if they have comments to say, or anybody else for that matter.
I think you said it well, Caleb. We just appreciate everybody's time and investment in this, to the presenters, the poster presenters. Everybody had to kind of do things outside of the box. So we're grateful to the participation and look forward to your future involvement.
I concur. Excellent job, everybody, all presenters, the posters, partners, board. Well done, everybody. This was really a all hands on deck effort. I don't think there's one person who didn't do anything. And so I really applaud everybody's efforts. With that, I have field work I have to get to at 1 o'clock, unfortunately. So I've got to, well, fortunately, I like going out and playing, but I unfortunately have to leave you all. So thank you so much to everybody for all your efforts. Everything was well done.
I will say that if you would like to review this conference, it was recorded today, and we will be sharing that video on our YouTube channel and posting a link for that on our webpage. So thanks again for tuning in, guys. And you all have a good weekend.
Hey, Caleb.
Yeah.
I was just gonna say one other thing for everybody who's still here. We are going to have a post-conference survey that will be, since this was all free and open, we don't necessarily have all of everybody's contacts information and stuff, but we'll put a post-conference survey up on our website.
Yes.
and probably emailed to the membership as well. So please take part in that survey and let us know what you thought of this new format.
Thanks, guys, and have a great weekend.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it.
It was awesome. Great
Thanks,
job.
everyone.